Hello, everybody. How are we doing today? My name is Vanessa, and I am the Chief Trainer at AMP Global Youth and Global Scholar. Thank you for joining us for our virtual AMPlifier training on advocacy and activism. It is absolutely my pleasure to be able to share some of the insights and the wisdoms that I have picked up from very clever, intelligent advocates and activists over the years in creating change. And so this is just a bit of a taster for what's in store for our AMP Action Lab, which runs within Global Scholar. Global Scholar being our leadership incubator for high school students to come and learn all about international affairs, social change, and global citizenship. If you are not familiar with Global Scholar, those are some of the amazing things that we'll be learning about, but it runs during the month of July in Washington, D.C. at the American University. We have 3 different sessions, and the first session is the 1st to the 13th of July, the second session is the 15th to the 27th of July, and the third session is the 15th to the 21st of July. For more information, and there is plenty more where that came from, for more information, check out www.globalscholar.org. That's globalscholar.org. Or you can always email me and I will be happy to answer any of your questions, any and all of them, at vanessaf@aidemocracy.org. That's Vanessa, F for Foxtrot, at aidemocracy.org. Okay, great. So, also very quickly, the AMP Action Lab. The AMP Action Lab is our skill builder in change making. So we learn loads of different skills, or rather skill sets. For example, social entrepreneurship, diversity, equity and inclusion, media literacy, advocacy and activism, campaign building, leading a team, strategic communications, all of these beautiful, glorious modules that I have the absolute honor of being able to facilitate during the Global Scholar program. So we have these 2 lovely curricula that come together that create the overall Global Scholar experience, and we would be so happy to receive your applications because we are currently accepting applications. We still have a little bit of funding left, so do try and get in as quickly as you can because July is around the corner. I can't believe it. Summer is upon us, which is fantastic. But while the sun continues to shine, there is plenty of change-making work to be done. And actually, I just want to give a massive shout out to youth across the country, across the United States, and all over the world, but particularly the United States, because of the amazing youth organizing and leadership that we have seen in this past year around issues that are really sensitive, that are really difficult and challenging to talk about, and can be quite polarizing, but the leadership and the organization has been phenomenal. So massive shout out to all of you young people out there who are wanting to make a difference and are willing to do whatever it takes. And that was kind of the inspiration of doing this amplifier, to just share some of the skills that, or rather some of the thought processes around advocacy and activism, and how we can continue to deepen our practice as people trying to reimagine the world and make it a changed place that is crafted ultimately by global youth. So thank you so much for joining. Let's get stuck in, I think. Some of you will be familiar with my face, which is fantastic. Some of you maybe not. So very quickly, I'll do a really quick introduction of myself. So as I mentioned, I am the Chief Trainer at AMP Global Youth and Global Scholar. And I've been working with AMP now for a number of years, and I love every year that I have the pleasure of being able to come back. Is just wonderful. So yeah, I've been working with AMP for a number of years now. I also work as a social impact educator, so I work around the world with different organizations in mainly advocacy and activism, but looking at it from different angles. So for example, I do a lot of anti-oppression, diversity, equity and inclusion work, or social entrepreneurship, or kind of the umbrella term for that would be social action, which is everything we're going to be talking about, and trying to do so in a systemic way, so that we are really looking at how can we shift systems so that we do not have to continue pumping billions of currency, of global currency, into developmental agencies and organizations, but rather the problems are solved permanently and sustainably for the long term for everyone. So that's a bit about me. I could go on, but I think we're just going to get stuck into some of the content, which is great. So advocacy and activism. I think the most useful thing to do at this point is to just have a working definition of what advocacy and activism is. And just, I'll say really quickly, if you have any questions, any comments at all, please feel free to write in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to answer directly. So yeah, feel free. I know we've got a couple of people watching, which is fantastic, but feel free to introduce yourself and also to write any questions or comments that you have about the content. Advocacy and activism, right, we're there, great. So having a working definition, I think, is a really, really good place to start as to what is advocacy and activism. So in terms of advocacy, let's start there. I have to say I stole this definition from Wikipedia, but it's a good definition. If it ain't broke, why fix it? So my Wikipedia definition, which I think is really encompassing, is that advocacy is an activity by an individual or group that aims to influence decisions within political, economic, and social systems and institutions, right? Did you get that? I'll say it one more time. Advocacy is an activity undertaken by an individual or a group looking to influence decisions within the political, economic, or social, and maybe we shouldn't forget environmental as well, systems and institutions. So that's advocacy, okay? And there are plenty of examples of advocacy. For example, a media campaign. This can be online, this can be offline, but some kind of campaign, doing public speaking, so maybe speaking at a conference, doing a TED Talk, for example. All of these are ways of advocating. And maybe doing some research, doing some commissioned research or just research of your own and putting it out there and maybe seeing where does that go. That might influence policy. It might be really good for an awareness raising campaign. But just doing some research and getting the facts and figures about an issue and how it affects people and animals and the natural environment in day-to-day life and in the 21st century, or maybe historically too. Point being, that is advocacy, right? That's our working definition. So we've established that truth, at least for the most part. And then a working definition for activism. So activism is the process of vigorous campaigning in public through actions to promote, disrupt, or direct social, economic, political, or environmental change. Okay, I'll say it one more time. Activism is the process of vigorous campaigning in public through strong actions to promote, disrupt, or direct social, economic, political, or environmental change. And some examples of activism may be street marches, we've seen lots of them, rallies, hunger strikes, sit-ins, strikes in the workplace, for example. So we've seen a lot of activism in the last year. As I was saying in my shout out to global youth, there's been a lot of activism that we've seen in the forms of the Women's March, for example, or March for Our Lives. Really, really kind of strong, visible, visceral ways of getting the message across that we want change and we want it now. And so I think the way I want to structure the rest of this amplifier, the way I want to structure it is to just be thinking about some questions that we need to consider when we are designing and delivering our activism and our advocacy, right? So I've got some questions. I haven't learned them off by heart, so excuse me for having a bit of paper to my right here. But the first question that I think is really important for us to think about is, what are the main things that we need to think about when planning our advocacy and planning our activism, right? And this is a really good starting point. What are the building blocks of any kind of advocacy or activism that we want to implement on campus, in our communities, nationally, internationally? what are the ways that we can do that, and what do we need to think about in the process? So bearing that in mind, the very first thing that we need to think about when we are planning our advocacy and activism excuse me, is purpose. We need to think about what is our purpose here. Why are we doing this? That is so important. What is the kind of impact that we want to have, and why? Why are we here? Why are we spending these minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years dedicating ourselves, and often a large proportion of our lives, to this advocacy and activism, to this cause? What is the cause of the cause? So even though it might sound quite basic, like, why are we doing this? It's often something that we actually really need to zoom in on and really think about. And hopefully the majority of you have seen a fantastic TED Talk that was delivered by a man called Simon Sinek. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it on YouTube. There's, I think, there's like an 18-minute version and a 10-minute version. So you can watch it over breakfast, for example. But it's fantastic. It's game-changing. And in it, he talks about, and this is how it's titled, Start with Why. Okay, and it really is, I think, top 3 TED Talks that have been the most viewed of all time. So it's worth having a look and getting the purpose, getting your why straight. Why are we doing this? You start with the why, and then we talk about the what, and then we talk about the how and the when and the who. All of that comes after, but the most important thing is the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we here? And why should other people come and join our cause? Why should other people answer that rallying call or that call to action? There needs to be a reason. And if you don't have that clear, then other people won't have that clear either. And if that message isn't clear, then it's not going to resonate with people. Because a lot of the time what we're talking about when we are building teams and we're building organizations, we're building movements, a lot of the time we're talking about how to resonate with people's emotions, right? And again, Simon Sinek talks a lot about this in his TED Talk, so definitely go and watch it. But how can you really chime with people? How can you vibe with them and do that in a way that unites all of you around the same vision? All right, you're all moving forward towards that North Star, right? So that's really important. So purpose, yes. And there's a really cool tool that's called the theory of change, which I probably will mention a couple of times. But with the theory of change, you can do it whether you are an advocate, an activist, an entrepreneur, a founder, a team leader. But basically it is a model, it's a map, if you like, that reverse engineers, I don't know if my left is to right or my right is to left, that reverse engineers the kind of impact that you want to make. So you start with impact and then you work your way backwards. All right. So it's impact, and then it's outcomes, and then it's outputs or activities, and then inputs. And I could talk about that in more detail, but I'll share it with you at the end of this AMPlifier training. So everything needs to be reverse engineered. It needs to be backpedaled from the why. Okay. Cool. Hopefully we've got that down. It's really important. Now, as I continue with this, with the theory of change, also known as the logic model as well, but as I continue with this theory of change, then we start to think about strategy. And strategy is such a big thing that we need to think about when we are planning our advocacy and our activism. It's huge. It's 4/5 of the game, right? So strategy. Let me give you another working definition for strategy so that we're all on the same page and we know what we're talking about. So I have 2 definitions here. The first one is that strategy is working out where you are strong and where your opponent is weak, and how to deploy your strength against their weakness to achieve your intended outcome. Okay, so where are you strong, where are they weak, and how can you use your strength, align your strengths with their weakness, so that you're actually coming, that you're actually having a very intentional outcome or effect. Great example, boxing. Fantastic example. This is where we see strategy at its best, right? If anybody has ever either watched a documentary of Muhammad Ali, or like if you're aware of his boxing amazingness, then you know that Muhammad Ali was an incredible strategist. And also, we cannot forget about his role actually as an activist as well. And you know, he created so much change with his refusal to fight in the Vietnam War. But strategy was a huge part of how he did that, whether it was in the ring or outside of the ring. So remembering that it's really important to work out what are my strengths and what are my opponent's weaknesses, right? And if we haven't gone through that thought process, then we're just feeling in the dark. So that's something that's really important. And as the amazing Marshall Gans says for our second working definition of strategy, strategy is turning the resources that you have into the power that you need to win the change that you want. Fantastic definition. One more time. Strategy is turning the resources that you have into the power that you need to win the change that you want. Okay? So it's really important to ask clever questions when we are planning our strategy. It's really important to ask the what. And we've already mentioned the why, right? But to also ask the what ifs, the clever questions of like, why is it important to do this or that? Why is it important? Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay, that's better. Sorry about that. We've got someone mowing the lawn. So why is it important to do X, Y, and Z? And what will that lead on to? Okay, so strategy, huge. And I'm going to come back to this, but it really is something that as activists, as young activists and advocates, we really need to place more importance on. It's everything. It's the way we are going to win. And if we don't know how we're going to win, intentionally, deliberately, step by step, with room to maneuver, but if we don't know how we're going to win, please, someone tell me, how are we going to win? Okay? And I really want to actually put this into perspective. I want to be very, very clear about how important strategy is. Donald Trump played a very strategic game. Hillary Clinton did not. Okay? And he's very, very open about that. And he had his strategy from day one. He had a strategy planned out from day one about the places he was going to hit, with what kind of message he was going to hit, and why. And at the end of the day, Donald Trump won and Hillary Clinton didn't, because of strategy. It's not about being complacent and thinking we're going to win because we have a nice, cheery, lovely sounding message of how we're going to make the world a better place. Like, it's time to get smart, and get smart quick. And that means having a good strategy planned out. So thinking strategically, planning strategically is really, really important. Cool. Shall we continue? I think we shall. So another point that continues off the back of this point about strategy is doing what is called a power analysis, okay? doing what is called a power analysis. Now, what does this mean? It also could be analyzing stakeholders, but I want to broaden it out to power, because at the center, at the core of everything that we are doing as advocates and activists, at the core is power. We are looking to influence power, to influence change, right? And so in order to gain power and leverage that power, we need to access power. And that means analyzing it. That means knowing the flow of power, right? And there are a few different types of power that we can consider. And I won't go into too much detail now, but hopefully I'll be able to follow up with some resources to help with our and deepen our understanding of what power looks like and how it shows up in different contexts. So the first type is personal power. Yeah, personal power. That's everything to do with you as a person, the direct power that you have both within you and at your disposal. And then we have relational power, and this is about relationships. So the kind of power that comes as a result of particular relationships, or the dynamic within a relationship as well. Is it top down? Is it bottom up? That's really important to consider. And actually, for those of you who are looking to build careers in international affairs or in the third sector in general, and you're looking to be leaders of change, for example, networking is a really important resource that you are going to need to get really good at in order to get that job or get that interview or to just get your foot in the door in the first place. And what is networking? It's using relational power, okay? And then we have positional power, which is about the kind of roles, positions, titles that people have. For example, within an organization, positional power is a CEO has a high level of positional power, whereas a coordinator has a lesser level of positional power. However, this is not as linear as one might think. Okay, so we can think more critically and deeply about who has the power, and I'm actually going to talk about that, like who actually have power and influence. And it's not always as straightforward as a kind of top-down hierarchy, if you like. And then the final type is structural power. So the kind of power that is embedded and ingrained in the institutions and the policies and the organizations and the bodies and the collectives, like the governing bodies, the power that is embedded in the governing bodies or the governing policies, for example, that actually translate into quite hard power. So those are the different types of power that we have. We also have what's called a stakeholder analysis as well, where you can look at the kind of power and the kind of influence and the kind of position, if you like, or for want of a better word, the kind of level of interest and investment in your project, in your campaign, in your organization that different stakeholders have. And remembering that power dynamics, power relationships are very fluid, okay? They are really, really fluid. So they're constantly changing and shifting and morphing and mutilating, and they're just constantly shifting. They're constantly in flux. So it's really important to remember that this is not a static process. And just because you've done a power analysis once doesn't mean that that's it, job done, everybody go home. I know that, you know, how power manifests in my ecosystem and that's it, I'm done. No, like power analysis is ongoing. It is an ongoing thing because power flows, they're continuous and they're always changing. So that's a bit about power analysis. And again, kind of an extension of that point is looking at how can we leverage, how can we use or utilize our power, which may be in terms of our personal power, for example, maybe the time, the resources, the energy that we have, how can we use that in a smart, efficient way? So often as advocates and activists, we are pushing against very hard to move systems, okay, systems of oppression, to be more explicit. We are swimming against a current or tide, right? Okay, so burnout is a real thing. it happens. Just because you're young and nimble now doesn't mean that you have an infinite amount of energy. And the emotional labor that goes into advocacy and activism as well is a real struggle. Like, the struggle is real. So it's really, really important to think about how can we work effectively and efficiently so that we are not banging our head against a brick wall, but we're actually being very smart and deliberate about where we invest our power, where we invest our time, resources, and energy. So this point is called, what we try and find is the intervention point, also known as a leverage point, okay? And this is essentially where we look at how can we create a ripple effect? How can we create a ripple effect or a domino effect? Where is it in our problem arena or area? Where is it in the system that I can tap into, that I can invest all of my energy or some of it, you know, how can I create an intervention or an action that creates a ripple effect? Because that is the point of concentration within the system where there is a lot of power to be penetrated, right? So to give an example, and I'm not very familiar with the engineering of a boat, but I know the basics, which is if you want to steer a boat in a particular direction, east, west, then, you know, left, right, then you're not going to get out, you're not going to jump out of the boat into the water and try and push the boat while swimming. Like, that's not going to happen for the most part, especially when we're talking about bigger boats. And in advocacy and activism, we're talking about bigger systems, right? Big systems of oppression, okay? So we're not going to get out and try and use our, you know, scrawny arms to try and push the boat against the current. That's not going to happen. What we are going to do, however, if we're in a sailing boat, what we are going to do, however, is we're going to steer using the rudder, rather, which is a tiny mechanism in the boat that essentially, it's very small, but it has a lot of power, a lot of influence in directing the boat, right? So thinking about using that analogy or metaphor to think about, right, how can I map out the system in a way where I have such a deep understanding, a 360 panoramic view of what's happening around me, whether it's on my campus or in my communities or the stakeholders that are involved, who are all influencing and creating and reinforcing the status quo. How can I have a good enough view of what's going on in order to be able to see where best to intervene? And hopefully that intervention will create a ripple effect or a tidal change that actually has a long lasting and deep impact and effect. So hopefully I've explained that well enough. It's just about being smart and not trying to swim against the current because we'll run out of steam, but actually to think, right, who is the stakeholder that I need to be talking to that can talk to 10,000 people rather than me thinking that I can go and, you know, approach each and every one. Maybe it's a social media influencer. That is essentially what social media influencers are used for. They are used as a strategic plan to be able to create a ripple effect where their message is amplified. They have a platform, and it's about high visibility and how to amplify that message because they have access to a large number of people. That's just one example of an intervention point. So it's really, really important to think about how can we be smart about finding that leverage point, you know, that steering wheel that's going to have a huge effect on the entire system. Okay, a couple more points on this question. And just as a reminder, we're still thinking about the main things that we need to think about when planning our advocacy and our activism. So just a couple of things to that we have to go on this question. So another one to think about is about intersecting systems, right? So intersectional thinking, intersectional anti-oppression. So, for example, any kind of issue or problem, any global challenge that we are dealing with, we need to be thinking in a highly complex and highly connected way. The 21st century and the globalized world in which we live in is highly interconnected, okay? And so we need to be understanding how systems of oppression, be it patriarchy, be it racism and white supremacy, be it sexism, be it capitalism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ableism, all of these systems of oppression, they are not to be considered in silos. They need to be considered as overlapping. Right? Because that's what happens. At any cross section of an issue that you are analyzing, you will always find overlapping systems of oppression, because there is no such thing as a single issue, which Audre Lorde, fantastic writer and thinker, kind of gave the world this quote and this thing to think about, which is that there is no such thing as a single issue. We need to be thinking about things in their plurality. We need to be thinking about things in terms of the multiple levels and intersections in which they are manifesting. So just remembering that we cannot work in silos, and this is something that a lot of mainstream discourse has been discussing about feminism, for example. So a huge kind of shortcoming of feminism is that it's often been about white women. Okay, it's been white feminism, and actually there has not been any consideration for the intersection between sexism and racism. And what does that mean for women of color? What does that mean for disabled women? What does that mean for trans women? What does feminism mean for these women as well? And also for men. So for all genders. So it's really important to be intersectional and intentional with our intersectionality. The final point on things that we need to think about when we're planning our advocacy and activism is about, right, who are we doing this for? Who are we targeting, right? Who is our audience? So important. It's so important to get out of our own heads, right? To get out of our own minds and to think outside of ourselves and put ourselves in the shoes of the person that we are either serving or the person that we are targeting, right? And that could be a stakeholder, that could be just a wide audience. But it's really important to really narrow down who is it that I am targeting with my message or with my action. So important. And there is a beautiful tool that's called the Empathy Map Canvas, where it's essentially a map of and where you can map out or input a person's lived experience in a moment in time, in a day, in a lifetime, and the kind of aspects that it focuses on are what that person says, what that person does, what that person feels, what that person hears, what are the intentions of that person, etc., etc. So really mapping out like a day in the life of, right? And that's really important to do. It's marketing 101, and yes, there is a huge overlap between advocacy, activism, and marketing. 100%. We're trying to change minds. We're trying to influence mindsets. That is marketing. We're just marketing for good, which is great, which is fantastic. So thinking about who is this for? Who is this for, and how can I feel empathy with that person? Now, I just want to give a quick caveat on this. Is that sometimes we are working in context or with issues where the opponent has very different understandings, perspectives, viewpoints, etc., which is allowed. But but it's really important to try and empathize with that person's humanity, with that person's reality. Why is it really important, no matter what, to try and empathize with that person's reality? Because we are here to win. As advocates and activists, we are here to win. And winning means understanding so that we can design and deliver a change-making campaign or movement or action that is effective and that wins. Okay, but we're not going to do that by just dismissing the other. And it's really important to actually do exactly the opposite of what I just said, and actually not other people at all, but continue thinking about how we can foster a culture of solidarity with our fellow human beings, even in the most intractable and triggering and polarizing issues and contexts. So to give an example of this, because this might sound quite abstract or philosophical or airy-fairy, to give an actual hands-on example. So domestic violence, right? Of course, and for the most part, it is women and trans women, women of all walks of life, who experience domestic violence, also especially disabled women, which is a terrible thing, and it's a really sensitive issue. And of course, men are often the perpetrators of this domestic violence. And so it can be very easy to jump to a demonization of men as perpetrators of domestic violence. And that's not to say that there isn't a time and a place. There is a massive, there has to be space to be angry. There has to be space to be truthful and to speak truth to power, and to condemn, actually, and to say no. However, empathizing with the perpetrator, empathizing with men and the way in which patriarchy affects both men and women and human beings of all walks of life, is a really important thing to do, because then we can understand how to create a solution, how to create an intervention. Okay, nobody ever got anywhere just demonizing and dismissing. We need to understand in order to be able to design and deliver an action or a campaign or a movement, and some kind of advocacy and activism. We need to understand what's going on in order to be able to resolve it. So remembering that empathy is not endorsement. Empathy is strategic. Empathy is loving, and that's absolutely number one, but empathy is strategic. As soon as we can feel empathy with the lived experiences of others, then we can understand those people better, and then we can work out how to influence those people for behavioral change. Okay, so that is pretty much all there is of this section, of this question about what are the main things we need to think about when considering how to plan an advocacy and activism. We're going to move on. So very quickly, this next question, we've got 20 minutes left, so we're gonna keep going. So this next question that I want us to touch on is, what do we often forget to think about? What do we often forget to think about? So when we are planning advocacy and activism, or some kind of social action, one of the first two things I will say that we've already mentioned, and I'm going to say them again. The first two things that we forget to think about are, number one, our purpose, and number two, our strategy. Okay, and I'm going to sum this up very quickly about how we often forget about these things that are very much at the center, at the core of everything we're doing. So in terms of our purpose and our strategy, it's so important to not only come up with a roadmap of how we are getting from A to B to Z, okay, but also to think about, what does it look like when we win? What does it look like when we win? How do we know when we are or will be successful? How will we know when we are successful? What does that look like? What does that impact look like? And how do we measure it? So this is really thinking a lot about the why are we here, and why what does that impact look like? And then also, again, reverse engineering. So going back to strategic planning of, okay, we know that we want to get there. We know why we want to get there. Let's think now about how we're going to get there. So it's reverse engineering that. So yes, really important to think about what does success look like? How do we know when we know that we've done it, that we've achieved the objective, that we've achieved the aim of the game? Okay, so that's really something that we need to think about. Yeah, that's kind of all there is on that point, I think. Another thing that we often forget to think about is risk. And this is something that we need to really bear in mind and actually not underestimate. Really important to do a risk assessment of any advocacy, any activism that you are going to undertake for a number of reasons. Personal safety, paramount, key. You're not of any use to anybody if you're out of action, if you've done something that has damaged you, whether reputationally, whether personally, physically, emotionally, mentally, etc. Right? It's really important to bear all these things in mind and to do a good risk assessment to make sure that you know what you are undertaking, what the expectations are, and the kind of the emerging factors that can play out actually, and being safe. So one really good example is as activists, when we are out on the streets, what are the dangers that can occur because we are out on the streets, putting our bodies in the way, right, or using our bodies. So doing a risk assessment for personal safety. And that's person as your whole human being, your full self. Also, doing a risk assessment to make sure that you are doing more good and less to no harm. This is something that's really, really important to think about. We always have good intentions. We have good intentions, and this really leads me nicely into my next point, is that we have good intentions. However, what are the unintended consequences of what we are doing? Okay, so it's really important to remember that when we are working within advocacy and activism, we are usually 9 times out of 10 working in order to create behavioral change, right? To change people's behavior. Great. We are working with human beings. We're working with people, and people tend to be socially complex beings that have a whole range of emotions, whole range of reactions. There is complexity in what we're doing in creating behavioral change, and it's not easy. And so it's really important to remember that behavioral change is not linear. It is a non-linear process with a lot of emergence happening. A lot of chaos as well, often happening. We are complex beings. So we have to look at what are the potential unintended consequences of what we are doing. And that means asking a lot of what if questions. Asking a lot of what if questions. What if I do A, will I get B? Or will it actually be F or K? Right? What is the byproduct? What is the side effect of what I'm doing? So it's important to do to ask what if questions and play out every single avenue that you can think of, trying to forecast what will happen if I do A, what will happen if I do B. How will people react? So I know, to give another good example, I know, and I can't remember exactly off the top of my head the details, but I know in a Latin American country, I can't remember which one, the government, the local government, wanted to reduce pollution in the community. So they decided to ban families from driving like families were charged more money. I can't remember exactly. Basically, families were only allowed to drive into the city or into the community for a limited amount of time. And the government installed cameras to be able to read number plates. So, you know, a really, really ambitious but well-intentioned, a good-intentioned project to try and bring down levels of contamination by trying to incentivize or disincentivise families from driving so much. What do you think the unintended consequence of this particular action was? What happened was that families just went out and bought 2 cars. Simple as that. So they could alternate from day to day. So they would drive the car one day, they would drive car A one day and then car B the next day, and they would go back and forth and do it that way. So actually, instead of driving down levels of pollution, now families had double the number of cars. Really important to play out every single scenario. It's called scenario planning. Play out every single scenario that we can think of, because we're not always going to be able to forecast or foresee every single consequence of our actions. That would be amazing if we could, but to really be intentional about trying to give time and space to thinking that through. And I will share a really, really cool video that actually that completely hits the nail on the head in terms of unintended consequences. It's really funny, and yeah, you'll be laughing by the end of it. But serious consequences for an action that was taken, and it's kind of like seeing like how will this pan out. Okay, so I think that comes to that I'll bring that question to a close. So so just to recount, so strategy and purpose, and in the other way around, purpose and then strategy, things that we always need to be remembering. And then risk, doing a risk assessment, and also thinking about what are the unintended consequences of what I'm doing. Right, we have 15 minutes left and we're going strong. We're going to keep going. So finally, last question to think about when thinking about advocacy and activism, what is it? How can we do it better? Is thinking about how can we extend our impact and our reach. Okay, how can we extend our reach and our impact as well, deepen our impact and extend our reach? So the very first thing I want to say about this is a fantastic concept that I love sharing. And it's this concept of scaling up and scaling out, right? So scaling up is essentially where you usually is a term used in the entrepreneurial community, where essentially you have an organization and you want to scale up by multiplying what you're doing. So multiplying the number of employees and workers that you have, by multiplying the number of branches that you have or franchises that you have, basically multiplying your operations presumably in different geographical locations, or maybe just the size of your organization, multiplying your operations in order to make more money, but also hopefully in order to scale up your impact as well. And that means reaching more people. Yes, it's a very numerical way of thinking about scale, right? So you can scale up by multiplying, right? By multiplying what you're doing and doing it more. But eventually that is going to most likely plateau. That eventually is not going to have the same kind of curve, if you like, of impact. Is not going to have the same amount of impact that in the different phases of production and implementation. So what do we need to do then? We need to scale out. It's not always about scaling up. It's not always about numbers. Sometimes it's about the what and the who. So scaling out is where you actually scale out the concept. So you bring different players in from the system, different stakeholders, and you convene them. What does that mean? You hold space for different stakeholders, government, community members, educational institutions, etc. You bring them all into a room or into some kind of space, virtual or offline, physical space, to talk about the importance of what you're trying to do. So it's not just about employing more people, which is scaling up, for example, or recruiting more people. It's not just about recruiting more people in terms of numbers, but actually, again, coming back to our strategy, coming back to our stakeholder analysis, actually thinking about who can I bring in the room who carries a level of power and a level of influence, so that we can actually look at embedding the impact that we are working on achieving, embedding that into the structural and institutional parts of or levels of our system. So to give an example, a lot of our young leaders, young and emerging leaders who apply for Global Scholar are very interested in looking at youth development through a lens of education, rights to education for young people around the world, in different countries around the world, right? So that's great. You can start building a team, can start building a campaign. And obviously you want to try and build to have a credible, but also a certain amount of a certain size. You want to be able to have that weight, right? That kind of punching power, which is great. So you're going to recruit, and that's definitely the beginning of what you're doing, and you want more and more people to get involved. Great. But then we need to start thinking about who are the players, again, that can penetrate those pockets of power, or those pockets of resistance. Who are the influencers that I can also bring to my cause, that is going to actually ratify, that is going to embed what we are trying to achieve, which is access to education for young people all over the world. Who are the players that we need to get into a room? Maybe governments, national governments, regional governments, maybe the United Nations. Maybe like government officials need to also be in the room, and we need to lobby government so that actually access to education is not just something that we are trying to achieve, but is actually like a human right that is recognized accordingly and is therefore implemented through policy and also through legislation, right? And then we see that we actually are being very smart about the way we're working, because now the concept, the impact that we are trying to achieve has been scaled out. So it in and of itself, it reaches more people, right? And we are able to be very strategic and tactical about how we do that without thinking that we need to just multiply. You can only multiply for so long. And actually there are often unintended consequences that come with multiplying that we also need to be aware of. But that's probably for another time, as we have 8 minutes left on the clock. So we're going to keep going. So scaling up, multiplying, scaling out, convening. Okay, let's do another. Which one should I do? We have limited time. I think I want to talk about framing. I think it's really important to talk about framing. Often we are so determined, we are so ambitious, we are so good-hearted enough, we are so enthusiastic and invested in our mission and in realizing our vision. And that's fantastic. That's brilliant. And often we will do whatever it takes in order to achieve that goal or realize that objective. And again, that passion, that determination is unrivaled, is fantastic. And that's what makes global youth such a powerful force. However, it's really important to think about, how do we frame issues, concepts, campaigns, narratives? How do we frame narratives so that actually we are not doing more harm than good. So often, for example, I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and often there is a very strong kind of economic argument that has definitely taken the mainstream by storm, about like the economic benefits of working in a diverse team. That is one argument to have, but actually, when we dissect that argument, are we doing more harm than good? Because we are anchoring the value of bringing people from different backgrounds, from different identities, bringing people from different backgrounds on board because of money and not because of a sense of humanity and solidarity. So if we continue to make economics, the economy, profit, economic gain, the reference point, then what happens when diversity is no longer profitable? It's really important to think about the framing and the values that we have behind and in front of, or rather in the forefront of our advocacy and activism. Really, really important. It's really important that we continue to try and frame what we're doing in ways that promote community, collaboration, co-creation, that promote internal, intrinsic value, as well as extrinsic as well. But having that anchor, having that start point of the reason why we're doing it is because it is a good thing to do, because it is an empathetic thing to do, because it's a compassionate thing to do. That's really important. And sometimes framing it as a do this because you are going to gain money, because you are going to feel more secure in your home. Speaking about global security, for example, there is a place for that. But when that is the principal reason why we are justifying what we're doing, why we're giving importance to what we're doing, then actually we forget about how about reforming migration policy because we want to help people, not because it is an issue of national security, for example. So just something to think about there. Finally, very quickly, just going to touch on two really quick points, and we're almost at time, which is great. It's been great timing. In terms of building and extending our reach and our impact, really important to invest in relationships, invest in people, not because you have anything to gain, but because it's really interesting, because it's really fulfilling, because it's really nourishing and enriching to get to know people, to invest in relationships. And when people feel seen and they feel heard and they feel valued and they see that you take an interest in people because you take an interest, not because you have anything to directly gain, even though that is a bonus and is part of strategy, yes, but investing in people, investing in relationships, stewarding those relationships, and being there from the beginning to the end. Hopefully not being an end, but being there, being present in that relationship is really important, because these people are your early adopters. They're your biggest fans. They're the people that you'll be recruiting into your movement, volunteers, for example, interns, fellow activists, fellow advocates, colleagues, fellow change makers. These people are aligned with your vision and mission, and it's really important that you invest in them. It's really important that you create space for them to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel appreciated. So not just kind of collecting business cards, not that kind of networking, but actually like talking to people and giving, being in the spirit of leading to serve and serving to lead. That's really important. So investing in relationships. You never know when that person who you've invested a lot of time in, you never know when they're going to become extremely useful. But first and foremost, as I mentioned earlier with the point about framing, more than anything, investing in people is about connecting to people's humanity and actually valuing where, you know, their positionality, valuing their contribution, valuing their value. So that's one, that's the penultimate point. And then the final one is, again, something that is a little bit strategic, which is about waiting for readiness. Waiting for signs of readiness in the system. So as I mentioned before, we are often swimming against the current. We're often swimming against the tide, and it's tiring. And banging our heads against the brick wall about issues, about social consciousness and or like consciousness raising and social awareness, banging our heads against the brick wall because people don't want to understand or just don't understand and are nervous and threatened by change. But it's really important to see where those moments of readiness open up, right? So when we see the narrative beginning to change, striking, and really, like, you know, jumping on that and jumping on that momentum and pushing that momentum. And social media has been a beautiful tool for creating readiness in conversations around anti-oppression and social change. Social media has been fantastic because it's a space where we get to debate and discuss, and you can see sparks of change, and it's really, and when you see those sparks igniting, it's about jumping on board and going with that flow. So sometimes it's also about recognizing that actually I am banging my head against the brick wall here, and while we all have, there's so much work to be done, and it's perpetual and it will continue and it won't stop. It's really important also to recognize, like, where is the best place right now for me to be investing my energy. Sometimes it is with your friend that or your family that just don't understand your politics and are deeply opposed to it, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's actually investing it in having dynamic discussions in your classroom with people who are maybe more sitting on the fence than completely and utterly in opposition to you. Always coming from a place of empathy, always coming from a place of dialogue, but actually choosing your battles, right? Choosing your battles and seeing which ones am I more likely to win, and not always going down the path of least resistance. That's not what I mean, because advocacy and activism is not about things being easy, like it rarely is, but actually just about thinking strategically. And it comes back to strategy. Where is the readiness in the system where, like, all of a sudden you know you're kind of seeing that people are having conversations about this, or there's some motivation to do that, and thinking, okay, how can I start to bring all of those points, draw all of those players in, and actually, like, you know, jump on that momentum. So these are the ways that we can look at extending and deepening our impact and our reach. And it's been a pleasure. It's been fantastic. We have come to the end of our virtual AMPlifier training on Advocacy and Activism 101. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful. Absolutely, if this has been of value to you, please comment, please like, please share. And please apply for Global Scholar. We would love to have you, and we still have some places available. So definitely get in touch. You've got my contact details. You can go to our website, www.globalscholar.org. Also, we have our AMP website as well, which is www.ampglobalyouth.org. Check them both out. Get in touch. Feel free to continue after the live nature of this AMPlifier training. Absolutely feel free in your real time, in your time zones, to drop some questions. I will be kind of looking at this for the next couple of days to make sure that I can answer any questions that are emerging without being raised for the people that are playing this back. So, once again, my name is Vanessa. I'm the Chief Trainer at AMP Global Youth and Global Scholar. It's been a fantastic hour. I absolutely love talking about this stuff, and hopefully I will be seeing you at Global Scholar to continue really deepening our practice. This is just one module of the AMP Action Lab, and it's probably about it's probably about a quarter of a module. So there is plenty of learning to be had, and I would absolutely love to continue sharing everything from social entrepreneurship to complex problem solving to systems thinking to media literacy to ethics and leadership to art and advocacy to campaign building. There's so much, and I would love to be able to share our insights, our learnings with you, and to also learn from you. So fingers crossed, DC, American University, starting 1st of July. Hopefully see you there. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. Keep creating change on the ground, in your communities, on your campuses. We love supporting you in the work of Global Youth and what you're doing in your leadership. So continue using us as a resource. We are here for you, working and serving you, Global Youth. And until next time, I bid you all a very fantastic week, a very fantastic day, and a very fantastic night. Thank you once again. See you soon, guys. Bye.